Welcome to another episode of Conduct Detrimental. I am Dan Luss, joined by Tarun Sharma. What's up, Tarun?
What's up, Dan? It's a good week.
Yeah, congrats to you. You know, you had your debut panel with Front Office Sports. You and Mike, standing alongside Doug Gottlieb. How did that feel?
I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, Dan, without the work that you and Wallach had done to get Conduct Detrimental to where it is, and Stephanie and Emily and Hannah and so many of our great contributors like Brendan. So it's awesome to be able to represent our group in a cool venue like that.
The goal of Conduct Detrimental, it's not lip service. I don't know if people like Barstool, but the Barstool model, Dave Portnoy started it, and then he started to get bigger and bigger, and he had to trust people to kind of go up and flap their wings, right? Same with Bill Simmons in The Ringer. But that's always been the goal, is to give young lawyers and law students opportunities to contribute, publish. There's only so many hours in the day, and Dan and I wanted to create a universe where people could, kind of do their own thing. So we got a call from AJ Perez, friend of the show, multiple time guest of the show. And he said, do you have any people at Conduct that could speak on our Clubhouse panel? And Tarun, I know you love the space, and I know Mike basically, is really into it. Mike and I did a podcast for Syracuse on NIL, and I go, Mike and Tarun would be great. So yeah, I mean, you guys killed it. 150 people watching that, and you guys did great. I got calls from our friends at Front Office Sports. I will not name them, but they thought I was going to be speaking, and I'm like, no, I trust Tarun and Mike. I think they'll do a great job. And then you guys crushed it. You guys are like tag team champions of Conduct Detrimental. Dan and I are like WCW champions. You like the WWE champions. How about that?
I'm not sure that I know what any of that means, but I appreciate the sentiment.
Okay, that's fine. You don't understand wrestling. It's okay. Well, maybe I'm the only one that does. In honor of your appearance on Front Office Sports, I know you were in the rabbit hole of college sports, and we've been spending a lot of time on this podcast talking about pro football issues and baseball issues and maybe a little bit of basketball. But this podcast spent a lot of time last year in the lead up to the NIL era talking about college sports. It's really all we spoke about for about a month. And, anytime there's a big NIL topic, like, for example, we had the Darren versus Darren NIL debate, but I think every so often it's worth wading back in and talking about what's going on different in college sports. So we have a college sports heavy episode. We're also going to bring in Emily Costanzo, one of our contributors to our show, to break down the United States women national team settlement. It's a big one. Emily's a former Division I soccer player, so we're going to get her take on that. So really the rundown for today, let's get into it. Then we're going to bring on Brendan Bell, our youngest contributor on Conduct Detrimental. He's a junior at Auburn. He's pre-law. He told me, and he'll talk about himself. He took his first LSAT class tonight, if you guys remember that, our listeners. And Brendan is ahead of the game. He's the guy that writes all those fun law school spotlights. Him and I are working on one for Fordham Law School right now, which will probably be out by the time you guys listen to this. He's done Tulane, Marquette, Arizona. Hunter is one of our other contributors that does as well. We'll have Hunter on too at some point. Okay, so the rundown for today, a story that we did not get to hit last week that I wanted to. National Labor Relations Board coming up again. Charges filed against USC, against UCLA, and the Pac-12, essentially for this whole conversation about not treating college athletes like employees. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about this inflection point that the NCAA is having, whether they are doing the right thing and whether student athletes, their decision to transfer or not, how much the NIL conversation is weighing in. And then third, we want to talk about a story that's really not getting reported on nationally. I think it's kind of big. People need to be paying attention to this. It's the conference realignment discussion. We spent a lot of time on Texas and Oklahoma. We said there will be other effects, and we're seeing them now. Conference USA in a battle with the AAC as well as the Sun Belt Conference. So 3 interesting cases. Now this last one, conference realignment. Marshall University has sued Conference USA for the ability to defect early. So maybe people aren't talking about it, but you should. You're a sports law fan, you're a college sports fan, you should be knowing what's going on. Okay, that being said, Tarun, before we get into the topics, let us remind our listeners our podcast is sponsored by Themis Bar Review, top bar prep company in the world. It's only fitting that we have Brendan on today because Brendan is a college student, and Brendan's going to go. He's going to matriculate maybe to Harvard Law School. He's that smart. You guys are going to hear him. Maybe Yale Law School. That's it. If he doesn't go to one of those two, his life will be a disappointment.
Those are the only 2 law schools.
That's it. 1 and 2. But yeah, even the college kids, they got to know about Themis Bar Review. So Themis Bar Review, top bar prep company in the entire country. Everyone's on the Themis Bar prep bandwagon at this point. Okay, Tarun, we ready to bring in Brendan?
I think so. I'm really excited to hear from him. He's somebody who's really passionate about this, and he's been all over the conference realignment space.
Without further ado, let us kick it over to Brendan Bell. Brendan, welcome to Conduct Detrimental, my friend. How are you?
Thank you. I'm glad to be aboard. Long time rider, but first time podcast guest. So happy to be on.
So I've told you this, similar to our next guest, Emily, that we'll bring on. You've caught our attention. You write not only for our website, you also write for Christy Dosh, friend of the show, on sports business. So I'm like, who is this college kid writing for a sports law website and a sports business website? I got to learn a little bit more about him. And then you started talking to me about that you were interested in going to law school. And then, you were kind of talking about which sports law societies, you should be looking at. And I'm like, what if we had Brendan basically from the perspective of a college student looking at these schools, because we can only give so much advice about what schools you should apply to or which jobs you should apply to. But you're in the space. I didn't know anything about I didn't know about Tulane and Marquette and Villanova. Those are basically our big three sports programs. Maybe throw Arizona State in there. And then Brendan, you took to town, and you and Hunter have been on the path writing about the program. So I guess before we give you into the college stuff, tell our listeners a little bit about your path. Maybe your first LSAT class.
3 hours a night, twice a week. We're going grinding away. But tonight was first of 2 months of prep. So looking forward to taking that in June. But so just sports have always been a big part of my life. And, if you can tie in, your education and with your passion, I think that's what everybody wants to do. To talk about our sports law spotlights, I've personally done Florida, Arizona State, Georgia, and I'm working on the Fordham one that'll be out soon with you. Yeah, it's just a good forum for students like me and, students who want to go to law school with sports-minded kind of interests to learn more about it, because, we all know about IP law and contract law and, immigration law, but sports law is a growing industry. And I feel like a lot of people should know about it, especially they love sports and want to, work in sports someday. And just, whether it's getting a degree program through sports law or just joining a sports law society where you're with like-minded people. I think that's a valuable tool that, students like me could use. So I'm just grateful for the platform to write about that along with other, sports issues. I particularly am interested in college sports law, and obviously we'll get into the issues and all that's going on in college sports. Yeah, it's just kind of what I've been writing about on Conduct Detrimental, and it's been an unbelievable opportunity.
I'm going to embarrass you just a little bit. This is me embarrassing people today. You are way, way, way ahead of the game. I think it goes without saying. As a college student writing for different sites, I don't know. I thought I was ahead of the game as a 1L doing it. I'm very impressed. So if you are a 1L and you're like, maybe I should be writing, Brandon's making you look bad right now. Just point it out. Okay. So one other, just a quick story. Did they make you take the diagnostic test tonight? Did you take a practice LSAT tonight?
Yeah, I did take one before I showed up tonight. So yes.
So listen, we're not going to talk about LSAT scores on this, but let's just say I bombed my LSAT diagnostic, bombed
Big
it.
time.
And
Yeah.
it terrified me. And I'm like, okay. And then I literally bought those US News and World Books reports. And I went to the back and I'm like, okay, bomb the LSATs. What's the worst possible law school I'm going to? And I'm like, okay, I guess I gotta get my grades up because bomb the LSAT. So anyway, yeah, that's what they do. They scare you with the first test and then they work you up. And the whole process. And then I started doing, this is maybe a little practice tip for you, Brendan, any of our young or pre-law people. I started doing a lot of Sudoku problems. And I'm like, that would kind of help me think about logic games. So that's my little pro tip for you. So let us get into the real topics. People have heard enough about our nonsense over here. We talked about 3 topics. Brendan, I'm gonna give it to you first. The story that Tarun and I wanted to address first. The NCAA has been this kind of sleeping giant. They've really done nothing. I've been on a couple panels with NCAA people and they're like, everyone kind of pushed them, hey, what's your next move? And they don't want to say anything. And I know, I've heard reports the NCAA is downsizing internally and, they're not really doing much. So the question is, what is the NCAA going to do? We saw a report from, ABC News, and I think a lot of outlets had it, but the NCAA was really at this inflection point that they were starting to review transfer decisions to see how much NIL played a role. So the NCAA, it could be hurry up and wait. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know why it's taking them so long. Brendan, we're just under a year into the NIL era, about 9 months in. Tell me what your thoughts are on the NCAA's role moving forward.
Yeah, I think last summer was just monumental on multiple different fronts with Alston, along with the transfer portal, along with conference realignment. It's kind of put the NCAA behind, the 8 ball in terms of what they can do. Can they really restrict NIL? Alston kind of has put their hands behind their backs, and with Texas and Oklahoma moving conferences and, athletes moving all across the country to potentially get NIL deals. It's just a crazy time. The NCAA is kind of in a spot where they don't really know what to do because they don't want to get caught behind a lawsuit or any type of legal action that would go against them. So just the conferences are kind of taking more of a lead on a lot of this stuff. Conferences and, state laws and everything is kind of, the power is shifting from the NCAA to the conferences. And it's just something to see as we as we move into the future with, college football playoff expansion talks, with how states and schools decide on their specific NIL policies. We've seen states that have repealed their NIL policies to put their schools in a more favorable position to land student athletes. So that's just something to watch. There's not one universal, NCAA is looking for congressional ruling on NIL, and they're just not getting it because, obviously there's more important issues in the country. There's just a lack of oversight in college athletics right now. So it's just a vacuum.
I think that you're completely right that the conferences are really in the driver's seat here. And I think that it's been this way for the last couple of years. Once the Power Six conferences kind of decided that the schools were going to be in charge, that's the conferences taking leadership. I think that we're in a position where the NCAA, never has there been so much asked of them, so many questions on so many fronts, and so little leadership being available. So I think that the states that are trusting the NCAA interim policy, and I know that the state where you go to school, Alabama, is one of them, as they've repealed their NIL legislation because it's more stringent than the interim policy, I would be fearful in terms of trusting the NCAA. And when you consider the fact that now the NCAA, the Division I Council, is going to go back and they're going to reassess NIL, who knows exactly what the result of that is going to be, what they're going to cull from that policy, what they're going to add in. So I think that we could be headed to an area of more frustration. Dan?
I did want to talk about it. Brendan, you brought up a point, and we probably should have made it its own topic, but from where the NCAA is going and where it's kind of been, this time last year, all the states were kind of positioning themselves, who's going to have the NIL law on the books, right? So I'm not going to do 100, the history that you and Mike did today with Front Office Sports, which was a good one. But California passes the law first. They said it's inactive in 2023. And then Florida jumps the gun. Our friend of the show, Darren Heitner, helps get that passed July 1st, 2021. So then, right, a year ago, right, February of 2021, there was kind of this rush, states are passing these laws because they don't know, to Tarun's point, we don't know what the NCAA is going to do. So at that point, there was a conversation. If you have an NIL law in the books, it will give you a recruiting advantage. So then all of a sudden, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, we started to see all the SEC start passing these NIL laws. So now fast forward, we are now in February of 2022. Now the opposite is true. You'd rather be a state that does not have an NIL law in the books because now do whatever you want. The NCAA has basically dropped any prohibitions on athletes getting paid and being some type of punishment. So now the NCAA is basically saying, yeah, we don't have any rules on the books. And if you're in a state that doesn't have an NIL in the law in the books, there's no boundaries as to what you can't do. So Alabama, I believe, is the first state in the country to repeal their NIL law. So it was such a big advantage to have an NIL law. Now it's a disadvantage to have one. So Alabama, to no shock at anybody, two of the biggest, we'll say, powerhouses in football in the last, 10, 15 years. Alabama, obviously, and Auburn, they're certainly in the conversation. But yeah, now that's the movement. So the question is, and I guess I'll give it to you, Brendan. We'll see where you want to go with it. But I have said since the beginning of this that the only way to have a true, fair national championship, right, is if you're not having recruiting battles decided on state law. I don't see why there is not a bigger groundswell for federal legislation. That, to the simple point, I walk into a bar in Hawaii, I know how old I have to be to drink. Same age in Florida, same age in Arkansas, same age in Montana. It's 21. Maybe it's not the best rule, but it's a clean rule. So, Brendan, I'm going to turn it to you. What do you think the future of federal legislation is in college sports?
Yeah, I think it's extremely necessary because, we all know that college sports is not always on a level playing field. We know that Alabama competes on a different level than Akron. Akron competes on a different level than North Carolina. And we all know that it's not equitable. But at the same time, do we really want schools, getting the best players because of NIL? And, this past, the signing period, obviously signing day in December and extended into February with the early and later signing period, we saw the first real football signing day where NIL played a big role. Texas A&M put themselves in a very good position because they leveraged it well, while other schools maybe fell behind because they're not setting up deals. We saw the University of Texas, found a charitable fund where all of their scholarship offensive linemen receive $50,000. And is that what we really want to being the ultimate determinant on where players go? How much is NIL determining where players go? And the NCAA is looking into that now. Do we really want individual state laws to be the reason why X recruit goes to X school. Yeah, I think it's necessary, but is it likely? I don't think so. Athletic departments, conferences, they're all looking for guidance, and they're just not getting it. And until there is like one universal law, I think this will continue to go on, and the rich will continue to get richer, as they say.
We're going to look at that. I mean, the NIL conversation is certainly not over, but we're going to, as we do as lawyers, we're going to issue spot. Tarun, that'll take us to maybe our second category within this NIL conversation. This battle, this unfair labor charge pertaining to USC, UCLA, in the Pac-12. So, the conversation that we're going to have, it's not going to happen yet. It's going to happen in a year, 2 years. Maybe it'll happen right now, but it's whether college athletes should be treated as employees and what fundamentally is the difference between the two. Tarun, tell us what's going on over on the West Coast.
This is something that I've written about in the Conduct Detrimental Sports Law Review newsletter, which people should sign up for. It gets in your inbox every Friday. But the National College Players Association filed those unfair labor practice charges.
Can you explain what that is, the National College Players Association? I don't think people have heard of that entity. It's important.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to represent themselves as a players' union for collegiate athletes. That's
like a pseudo union. They're not
it.
really a union, but like they're kind of a union.
Right. And this is headed up by the same person that tried to help Kane Coulter unionize the Northwestern football team about 5-6 years ago. Obviously, that got to the NLRB, but failed because the NLRB chose at that time not to rock the boat. So obviously, completely different era, right? Between 2014, 2016, and today, there's been such massive upheaval in the way that the NCAA's policies apply now. So I think that this is like a really pivotal moment where the NLRB in September, Jennifer Abruzzo, who is the general counsel of the NLRB, she published a memo that indicated that she believes that student athletes at the college level are employees. And in fact, she said that the term student athletes is a means of wage suppression, and she didn't want to hear that phrase anymore. So to me, that indicates that the NLRB is open to these discussions of employment status. And so now they've got two challenges in front of them, one from the National College Players Association, and then another from a gentleman named Michael Sue, HSU, who is from here in Minnesota, and he's an athlete advocate. So this is going to be a long challenge. There's 18 months almost, what experts expect once the charge is filed to when we'll have a decision. I think that the most interesting thing that we might see in the interim, the NLRB has subpoena power. So maybe if they are able to subpoena some of the crucial players here, whether that's Mark Emmert, whether that's the conference heads or the heads of major universities, it might be interesting to hear their take on it. But what I wrote in the newsletter and what I want to make really clear is that this can go really wrong if we rush into some sort of employer-employee relationship without addressing how that's going to affect the concept, the market of college sports that we love. I think at some base level, we really love college sports. And so we want to see it sustained. And we also want student athletes to have more rights, and we want them to be able to earn money based on the hard work that they're putting in. So I think that those key stakeholders really have to get into a room together, whether that's the conferences deciding, is the NCAA the best way to go forward? The players deciding, do they want to be a union, and how do they want to collectively bargain? These are conversations that have to be had together, and doing it in a piecemeal fashion is kind of how we're going to end up with a piecemeal result.
So you talk about collective bargaining. I think what people need to understand, and we can't say this any more clear, if players and particular teams, right, in particular sports are given the right to strike and the right to have collective bargaining discussions, there is certainly a world where football players will not want the revenue they generate to go to other sports. Right. That's how college sports economics works essentially right now. Football makes the most money, and to another extent, basketball, and those profits are sprinkled throughout the schools. So, if I'm the father of a college football player, I don't really care how much money the swimming program gets or the wrestling program gets. I want my son, right? Just like Tarun, you and I are going to talk about it later, but Major League Baseball is having this, these labor discussions right now. 50% of the pie. That's always what baseball players are going to want. Maybe they'll want more. But imagine dividing the revenue pie up, for football to get half their revenue. And then, the ADs only have half of that pie to sprinkle throughout. So I don't know. It's not going to be something like NIL, which has universal approval. The right for college athletes to strike, to be locked out, to be fired, and maybe hurt other sports. That's not going to have universal approval. Brendan, I know you follow this stuff. You're certainly, you're not in law school yet, but I know you're familiar with collective bargaining. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, collective bargaining kind of has I'm a baseball fan like many of us, and that's obviously driving us all crazy. But in college sports, I mean, if college football players in particular are deemed employees, then like the issues at hand could be extremely broad. Baseball and the NFL, MLB, and NHL, it's all contracts and stuff like that. But we're in college collective bargaining, we could be talking about like the amount of food they receive or the amount of like amenities they get, where they live, all the other stuff. Because as we know, student athletes, it's more than just the sport they play. It's the education, it's where they live, it's their books. All that stuff is accounted for. And if you make them employees, then all that stuff goes to the table. And so do college athletes at the end of the day want to be deemed employees? Because a lot of the stuff they get right now, just, implied for, if you play football for Auburn University, you live here, you get this amount of food, you get all of the books paid for, all that stuff. Will that be the case if you're deemed an employee? And all that stuff will be collective bargaining. In addition, the transfer portal has kind of created an idea where coaches are saying it's free agency, but if they're employees, are there contracts stipulating you have to stay at a school for this amount of years, and if you leave, you owe this, or you must do this. So college athletes and college football players in particular being deemed employees is a slippery slope that sounds good in theory, but when you really consider all the factors that go into it, it could be a huge ordeal for college football and the College Football Players Association.
If you're people looking for paper topics to write about, I would highly recommend any portion of this student athletes as employees conversation. Actually, we're not really allowed to call college athletes student athletes anymore. I guess that's a term that's going to be extinct at some point if you ask the NLRB. Okay. So let us move over to our final segment of this college sports conversation. I'm trying to think when this was. I know it was while I was teaching my class. So I don't know. It was around the fall. There was a conversation about Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12. And that doesn't really happen. You don't have two blue bloods jumping conferences. So we said you have the Power Five. And if you have two of the top schools in one of the Power Five conferences, that's the Big 12, moving over to the SEC. The SEC, though, all of a sudden goes to 16 teams. That's kind of an odd look. And I think that brought the Big 12 down to 10 teams, that point, maybe even 8 teams. I think it's actually brought it down to 8 at that point. So then, okay, you have to say, well, what's going to happen here? This sounds very confusing for our non-college sports fans. But the Big 10 at that point, it still has 14 schools. The Big 12 had 8 schools. As confusing as it is, just bear with us. They had less schools than 16. Pac-12, I'm not even getting started on that, but everyone has less schools than the SEC. So if the Power Five want to keep pace with the SEC, they start needing to pull schools from other conferences. So lo and behold, that's kind of what happened. For the Big 12 to stay afloat, they had to steal some schools, and then the conference that they stole from had to steal from another conference, and they had to bring some schools up from the FCS to the FBS. So it's kind of a cluster, and we're still seeing the ramifications of that now, 6 months later. So what we have is this conference realignment battle that's still going on. We had a lawsuit that was filed yesterday by Marshall University against Conference USA. Brendan, I know you're in Auburn now, but you are from Dallas. That's where Conference USA is headquartered. Before we get into the legalese, why Marshall is suing a conference for the right to leave, if you can, as best as you can, why don't you give us a little bit of the lay of the land in some of these mid-major conferences?
Okay, so as we mentioned before, the last summer where we got NIL, we got transfer portal, and like the biggest bombshell was Texas and OU leaving the Big 12 for the SEC. No one expected it. It halted playoff expansion talks. It changed all that. However, the Big 12, so kind of how it worked was a domino effect. Like the Big 12 losing their 2 flagship members needed to fill the spots, and so they went after BYU, who was independent. So they kind of were, and they didn't have a conference affiliation before. But the bigger deal was they added Houston, Cincinnati, and UCF from the American Conference, which was widely regarded as the best group of 5 conference below the Power 5. Obviously, Cincinnati made the college football playoff last year, so their football success, and UCF has been in the New Year's Six and is along with Houston. And so that left the American Conference needing to go find members. So the American reached out to 6 Conference USA members: University of Alabama, Birmingham, University of North Texas, Charlotte, Florida Atlantic, Rice, and UTSA, who were obviously members of the Conference USA league. And so that took 6 of the original 14 off the Conference USA. And sensing that the Conference USA was in a weak position, the Sun Belt Conference took 3 additional members from that conference: Old Dominion, Marshall, and Southern Miss.
Well, I'm going to stop you for a second. They didn't really take them, right? This is we're in a position of limbo right now. They're attempting to take them.
Yeah, so they will eventually take them, but
well, do we know that?
I think eventually it'll happen, but when it happens is the question that we're getting into in this segment.
Brendan, let me paint the picture of the legal battlefield. I'm going to rely on you for a little bit of the math here, and you broke it down very well. Here's what's happening right now. For our lawyers here, they're trying to figure out, the procedural posturing of this. Marshall, Old Dominion, and Southern Miss announced their intention to leave the conference. Under the conference's laws, schools have to provide 14 months notice in order to leave. The problem is those 3 schools did not want to provide 14 months for whatever reason. The 6 schools that Brendan talked about that are leaving for, Brendan, the AAC, am I going to get this right?
Yes, the American Athletic Conference.
They're leaving in 2023. So they've decided, there's 9 schools in total trying to bolt from Conference USA. I don't know why everyone hates Conference USA. I think Conference USA is a nice place, but everyone wants to leave. 6 schools are bouncing, and they're adhering to these 14-month notice, and these 3 schools are not. So Marshall says, hey, we're leaving. Southern Miss says, hey, we're leaving. Old Dominion says, hey, we're leaving. Goodbye. Conference USA puts out a statement and essentially says, actually, here's the schedule for the upcoming year. We're putting Marshall in the schedule, Southern Miss, Old Dominion, and these schools know they have contractual obligations and they have to stay in the conference. So it puts Sun Belt, the conference they were trying to go to, in a tough position. Do they release their schedule and put Marshall in there? It's this whole kind of will they, won't they? So what happens last week, there is a demand for arbitration sent by Conference USA to Marshall, and I imagine also to Southern Miss and to Old Dominion, saying, hey, we're actually going to try to resolve this with you amicably. You are not allowed to leave because we said 14 months notice. We have to find a suitable replacement for you. So we're going to put this into arbitration. Marshall says, we're not going to arbitration. And I imagine arbitration would have been in Dallas, Texas. That's where Conference USA is headquartered. Marshall goes, we're suing you in the state of West Virginia. That's our home territory. We're not going to arbitration in a whatever form you want us to. So that's where we are right now. Marshall is suing for a declaratory judgment and for an injunction against Conference USA. They don't want to go to arbitration. They want this thing to be fought. Brendan, you're our college guy here. Why can't Marshall, Southern Miss, right, and Old Dominion, why can't they just cut a check to Conference USA? I'm missing that part.
That's the issue that a lot of people are wondering, because, many people believe that the remedy in this case is the exit fee that these 3 member schools that will pay. However, the exit fee in the Conference USA is not as high as it is in the American Athletic, which is why that these 3 members, ODU, Marshall, and Southern Miss, think that they're good. They're just going to pay this and leave now because, as we know, staying in a conference that you're going to leave is just such a weird thing. Like how long Texas and Oklahoma are going to be in the Big 12. They're going to get, when they go on the road, it's going to be hostile environments. It's just a bad situation for everyone involved. So common rationale is just like, why don't you just let them leave? But the Conference USA is like, no, you're going to stay. Your contract, like our conference bylaws say you must stay unless you give us 14 months notice. But these 3 schools are like, they're ready to go. Conference USA is in a really vulnerable position right now. They did add 4 additional members that will come in after they leave. But the state of the 2022 season is just in flux because you've got schools who are going to be up against it to determine, it's like obviously football comes in September. Hotels need to be booked. It's not easy to travel with 85 scholarship players and all the support staff and coaches. I think Conference USA once an injunction be filed in court, it'll be interesting to see if they're able to get that. Many people think this will end in settlement, and Old Dominion Marshall and Southern Miss will end up in the Sun Belt in 2022. It's a pressing issue right now because time is of the essence.
Yeah, I think the universities are hoping to get that injunction so that they can just get this sorted out and avoid having to go to arbitration. But something that you mentioned, Dan, in terms of where this case was filed, said in West Virginia, Marshall filing this in their home county is just like a fun little example of forum shopping where, they know that they're going to get that home cooking, and who knows, maybe the judge went to Marshall or something like that. It's just a fun way to kind of stack the deck for yourself.
Yeah, it's 100%. And I think we'd be remiss if I didn't say this here. I don't think this is a application by Conference USA about money. I kind of teed you up, right? At least my thought on this. I don't think there's a check that Marshall could write to Conference USA at this point. Conference USA is arguing we are down to 9 teams. We might not exist anymore. The vultures are circling. They might try to steal more of our programs. You can cut us a check for how much you want. But if another school leaves and we don't replace it, we might not exist anymore. And that's what happened with Bob Bowlesby in the Big 12 this time last year. The guy sent a cease and desist letter, not to Sankey over in SEC, the commissioner of the SEC. He sent it to ESPN and he said, "We hear that you guys are involved in stealing our teams." So I'm like, wow, this guy's going scorched earth. He's going after ESPN. That's pretty crazy. And then I thought of it. I'm like, Bob Bowlesby is the commissioner of the Big 12. Can't be a conference commissioner if the conference doesn't exist. And I think that was a really smart move by Bowlesby to lay down the hammer and basically just say, hey, I don't care what I'm going to do at this point. I'll go after you for tortious interference with the contract. So people are saying, why has this never happened before? What Bob Bowlesby did has never happened before. And I think Conference USA is seeing that they don't want to lose control so easily and watch another team try to leave with less than 14 months notice. So it's probably, you could probably survive it with these 3 teams. You're down to 9. But if you're remaining 9 schools, they try to pull a Marshall and bounce on you, right? All of a sudden the conference has 6 teams, 5 teams. And then all of a sudden, right, the Big East that no longer exists in football, right? It's happened before. It's happened in recent memory. Okay, Brendan, I'm going to let you have the last words on Conference USA, and then we're going to bid farewell to you, my friend. What do you got for us?
So what's really interesting about all this is right before the American and Sun Belt Conference, announced that they were adding these members, the Conference USA Conference Commissioner sent a letter to the Commissioner of the American Athletic and the Sun Belt Conference asking for a joint, alliance, kind of what we saw with the ACC, Big Ten, and Pac-12. But obviously those 2 conferences were in the works to add those other members. So it's really interesting because Conference USA about a decade ago was the premier, non-power conference. It had, Houston, SMU, UCF all used to be in Conference USA. While the Sun Belt Conference, opted for, local, smaller fan bases, but were passionate about football. And Conference USA based in a lot of, large media markets like Houston, like Rice, Alabama, Birmingham, FAU's in the Boca Raton area. So they're in a lot of, big media markets, which was like the big deal in the last round of conference realignment. But now the big deal is having, passionate fan bases. And while the Sun Belt might not have, the big media markets like a Dallas or Houston or any of that, they have passionate fan bases in smaller communities like Statesboro, Georgia, and Boone, North Carolina, that might not have like the big time, media centric like television markets. They just have passionate fans, and that's winning the day right now. The Sun Belt is positioning itself to be one of the best group of 5 conferences, and they'll be competing for a potential expanded playoff spot when we get there. So it's just kind of an interesting time in the group of 5 world.
Brendan, we're going to bring you back on when we start having these conversations about expanded college football playoffs, because I know that's probably the next legal battle. Brendan, thank you for joining us, and look out for Brendan's next article on Conduct Detrimental about Fordham sports law, maybe the first competition dynasty in sports law history. How about that? Brendan, thanks again, my friend.
Thanks for having me on.
So that was Brendan Bell. Brendan has been so helpful to us, on the website. And again, I don't know if you want to feel bad about where you are in life, Brendan, as a junior at Auburn, is already writing for 2 websites. So I'm impressed. I don't know what the future holds for Brendan. Certainly, it is very bright. We mentioned at the top, we had college sports stories. We wanted to talk about soccer. Emily Costanzo, she is, again, one half of Misconduct with Stephanie Weisberger. Emily is a soccer nut. She is always, when you look at the stuff that Emily writes, it's usually soccer-based. And I knew Emily would have some good takes in this.
Absolutely. I love her passion.
I think that's the word, passion. Without further ado, let us kick it over to Emily Costanzo. Emily, we thought to call you. Our listeners that don't know, Emily Costanzo is one half of Misconduct with Stephanie Weissenberger, who our listeners do know. Emily's been on the pod with us before doing some Cleveland Guardian stuff. Emily is a former Division I soccer player at UConn. And when I saw the big news, the settlement between the women's national team and U.S. Soccer, I knew that Emily would know. I knew that Emily would be having some hot takes on this. So Emily, first, welcome to Conduct Detrimental. Your first time as a real guest. How about that?
I know it's actually pretty exciting. I'm sad it took you this long to invite me on.
Wow. So Emily is about 5 cups of coffee deep, 5.5, we'll say. In Emily's background, she has a crazy kind of like corkboard-esque, like Claire Danes in Homeland. I don't know what you are doing, but I respect that in the middle of your brief writing, you stopped. You're like, you know what? I got to inform the listeners of Conduct Detrimental about this soccer settlement. So Emily, the floor is yours. You can go in any direction when you want with this answer. What is your big takeaway from this massive settlement between U.S. Soccer and the United States women's national team?
What I want to start with is that this is a win for women's soccer. This is a win for women's sports. I think that it's going to be met with criticism because that's just the way our media works. And we are not at the end of this journey by any means, but this is a tremendous, tremendous win. I know there's been a little bit of backlash. Hope Solo's come out and said some things about the settlement, which we'll touch on later. But basically, just so the listeners have a background, this settlement has not been finalized yet. It's contingent on the U.S. women's national team signing their CBA with U.S. Soccer. But if that goes through, we're looking at $24 million settlement for the women.
Let's do a little bit of brief background. And that was a good place to start. So for those that don't know, U.S. Soccer and the United States women's national team, those two entities, if you're saying like, why is U.S. Soccer fighting with each other? It's an interesting lawsuit. The impetus of this lawsuit, it's a 6-year battle. It's a 3-year litigation battle. So my understanding, Em, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you are Miss UConn, right? Weren't you voted like the Gatorade Soccer Player of the Year?
Oh, yeah, multiple times.
Multiple times in multiple states. First person ever to do it.
Right. I left my trophies at home, but it's fine.
Okay. So this is my understanding of what happened, right? The men's national team is making more money. This was historically. They're making more money than the women, despite the fact, and I know you're looking at me because I know what's going on here, okay? But we'll say per game, the men were making more money, while the women were going on and winning World Cups, while the men weren't even, at least in the most recent cycle, weren't even making the World Cup. So, can you break this down, like this kind of, just this dichotomy between men's and women's soccer, how this battle has gone over the last 6 years, how the narrative has changed, and why women were earning less than men if they were the more superior team just in terms of on-field performance?
Right. So the first answer to that is that although both the men's national team and the women's national team are both under that U.S. Soccer umbrella, per their current CBAs, they agreed to 2 different pay structures. So the men agreed to just a typical pay for play. You get called up to the national camp, you get money. You get minutes, you get money. Whereas the women agreed to a more concrete agreement in that they have 16 players who get a yearly salary of $100K from U.S. Soccer, and then the rest of the players on the roster, so about 6 to 8, depending, they will get that typical pay for play model. So based on their concrete setup on the front end, that was how the discrepancy in the money occurred initially. And they discussed this in the first round of the lawsuit, which Dan, I know we'll talk about, but the women pushed back on the court and said, you have to look at the rate that they're being paid, not just the standard amounts.
Okay, that's fair. And I think what ended up happening, this is at least my rudimentary understanding of the lawsuit, is that by the end of the lawsuit, the women had actually started to make more than the men. And that's partially because the men didn't make the World Cup tournament. So it kind of hurt their argument a little bit, right?
And that's what I was saying, in that the women pushed back on the court and said we had to win more and we had to play more. So it was kind of an apples and oranges argument that, well, yes, we're making more because we're playing longer, we're advancing farther, and they're not. And then again, on the World Cup stage, which is one of the massive parts of this settlement, was that U.S. Soccer has come out in this settlement and said that they agreed to pay the men and the women an equal amount of friendly money and tournament money, which includes notably the World Cup.
Okay, so I have one more question. I know Tarun has a couple questions for you on your girl Hope Solo, and I'm half joking. Emily, the reason I wanted to have you on, you get really fiery about certain topics. This is a positive thing. I do as well, but I know this topic is near and dear to you. The U.S. soccer president has changed during the course of this lawsuit. And I think part of the reason this lawsuit gets settled is because of that change in leadership. Very much an open-ended question, at a really high level. Can you explain to our listeners what went on in U.S. soccer and really kind of how we got here? We kind of had a change of leadership in the middle of all this, and then all of a sudden the lawsuit gets resolved. So, I think that's a pretty important facet of this lawsuit.
Yes. So first of all, it wasn't all of a sudden, but I do take your point. And Cindy Parlow-Cone is the current president, and she's awesome. Also notably, she was a player, and further notably, the current players are aligning much stronger with her than they are with the previous president, who is Carlos Cordera.
When did Carlos switch? When was this? Because
he resigned, and I'm quote resigned in March 2020, so that was a year after the lawsuit that we know today came out. So the first filing was March 8th, 2019, and a year later, March 2020. The meat of the lawsuit and the specific language used in some of the briefs started hitting mainstream media. Now, Mr. Cordera was president at that time, and part of the language that came out that the U.S. Soccer was arguing in their briefs where they were saying things like, and I remember this to this day, they were saying things like the women's national team players do not perform equal work requiring equal skill and effort in comparison to the men. They said that the overall soccer playing ability required at the senior men's level is influenced by things such as strength and speed. And essentially, it was perceived to be incredibly sexist. It was perceived to be knocking the women down despite all of their success. And then that language gets out, and I don't know the specific timeline, but it was weeks, if not days later, we hear that Carlos is retiring. And Cindy Parlow-Cone, who's still the president now, stepped in to fill his shoes.
So I'll just say this, and then Tarun, I'll hand it over to you. The optics, right, of the United States women's national team fighting with U.S. soccer is not good. And then when Cindy Parlow-Cone takes over, right, all of a sudden the optics have now changed, right? So, sometimes, and I'm just say it, right? Like men can be really pigheaded and just fight for the purpose of fighting, right? And this lawsuit seemed to have taken a very different track. I remember when she took over, she made a statement that they were going to try to make resolving this lawsuit a priority.
Right.
In the court system, U.S. soccer had started to win and started to have the upper hand as we moved further along. But this case is settled to send a message, right? Like, U.S. soccer shouldn't be fighting with the women's national team, right? It's more important than that, right?
Right. And I totally agree in that. And you're right in saying that Cone came on the stage and said, we want to get this CBA ratified, and we are attacking the equal pay issue. And she said that from the jump. Articles everywhere are really saying that this is a promise kept on her behalf, and it's huge. That's not to say, obviously, of course, a male could be an incredibly successful president of U.S. soccer. But the fact of the matter is, it's what you just said, Dan, is there are two entities that should be on the same team, no pun intended, and they've been fighting with each other for years. So now the hope is we look at this lawsuit with the recognition that we're nowhere near done. It's just a step in the right direction. Hopefully that's a step that for the first time in 6 years, U.S. soccer and U.S. women's national team and the men's team can take that step, all three of them moving forward together, which is huge. And not for nothing, Carlos Cordera is running for re-election to president of U.S. soccer, which those are being held first week of March, which is insane. And multiple notable athletes, Megan Rapinoe, Alex Morgan, et cetera, female athletes have come out and said, no, he doesn't have our vote, because why would he? And I just wish he wasn't running at all, but I also would not mind to see him have a painful loss.
Speaking of people who ran for U.S. soccer president, Hope Solo had run in 2018, and she came out and lost. And she came out today and said that this settlement, very different from what you said, is not a huge win. It's heartbreaking and infuriating. Those are her words. Can you shed some light on why she might feel that way, and if that actually captures the sentiment of more than just her?
So in short, no. The overwhelming majority of notable names in women's soccer, so Hope Solo filed along with 4 other athletes, Becky Sauerbrunn, Rapinoe, Alex Morgan, and Carly Lloyd, which are all names we know, filed a complaint in 2016 with the EEOC also alleging the same type of complaint in that it was gender discrimination on the basis of pay. So anyway, that lawsuit evolved into what it is today, but all four of the remainder have all spoken out very publicly and said, this is phenomenal. This is a great step in the right direction for women's soccer. It's important to say that none of these athletes are saying, oh, women's soccer and men's soccer are equal and everything's great and no problems at all. And we're rainbows and daisies in the world of soccer. That's not what they're saying. They're saying this is a meaningful step forward. And Hope's problem with the settlement, honestly, I think it's a really juvenile response on her behalf, because she's focusing on the fact that, which is true, that this settlement is contingent upon the ratification of the CBA. But the whole point of why this settlement is getting so much attention is because all the powers that be, all signs are pointing to yes, that this CBA is ratified. So, I mean, heartbreaking and infuriating. Not really. This looks like this could be resolved by the end of March.
I can kind of sense that this seems like sour grapes. So to her point, though, about the CBA, I think you mentioned the CBA it had expired at the end of December, but it's been extended until the end of March. So do you think that this is going to be an easy process, or is this something like Major League Baseball lockout where we can expect like a big delay and further problems that are going to complicate the settlement?
So in short, I think I wouldn't say easy, but I think that the bulk of the work has been done. And again, if the powers that be are as smart as I hope they are, they're going to ride this wave. And because they've come out publicly, they being the president, the players, et cetera, have come out publicly and said, yo, end of March is our goal. And that's the goal, that we have to sign this thing and get moving and move forward. Also, too, Tarun, that I think is really important is this: we are living in the most monumental era of women's sport ever. And that's not even arguable. I really don't think it is. And that's indicative in, Becky Sauerbrunn came out today and said, we can't do this without the 99ers, who are the famous women's soccer 99 team. We can't do this without the WNBA. We can't do this without Serena and Venus Williams. There's so much attention on women's sport and such a push to advance the games that I think that, again, purely from a business standpoint, ride this wave, sign the CBA and move forward. And also, not for nothing, but the men's team is, to my understanding, is incredibly supportive, which is going to be huge for this because it's their CBA as well.
And obviously you broke that down in only the way that you could. I'm going to embarrass you with this story. So I speak to a lot of law students. I speak to a lot of college students as Brendan Bell. I might have had my favorite call with a student with you, Emily. Do you know what I'm about to say? Do you remember this phone call?
I think I might, Dan.
So Emily, we had the Conduct Detrimental.com era. We invited a lot of people to write for us. And, we had this wave of articles that people were writing. And Emily, I just kind of got lost in the shuffle. Like the day we announced, we're starting the era, Emily wrote me this really nice LinkedIn message. And then just somehow in the shuffle, I missed it. I missed this really nice, long, beautiful message. And I think I came back 2-3 weeks later and I'm like, oh my God, I missed this. So, I said, oh, Emily, I'll get you set up writing. And I read the note. It was really sweet and it was really heartfelt. And then Emily starts writing article after article after article after article. I'm like, who is this Emily Costanzo person? So I made it a point to speak to her and I'm like, the message that she wrote was really nice and heartfelt. And the articles that you were writing were written with a style that I could feel her voice speaking to me on the page. And I'm like, okay, this person's a good writer, speaks well, Division I college athlete. I'm like, let's talk to Emily. So I called Emily on the way home from work. That's when I make a lot of my phone calls, as Tarun, And Emily, for we'll say over under about half an hour, basically proceeded to sell me on how she was the future of the world. That just Emily, I'm like, I'll vote for Emily for president at this point. I feel this passion burning from her. And, that's what you get, in this podcast here. And that's Emily, why we tapped you for misconduct. So I guess the lesson, I'll give you the platform, you and I don't know each other. We are not from the same state. We have nothing. And I'm like, I had 2 conversations with you and I'm like, I got to find something to do with Emily. I have to find somewhere to place her in this weird universe that we have. It's just you're a very passionate person. Emily, now you're working for the United States Soccer League. I sensed it. I sensed the energy right away.
Listen, Dan, I'm blushing. I really am. But
you are. We're on video right now.
I am. I was going to say, I know this is turning into a podcast, but can confirm that may or may not be the over under 5 coffees, but whatever. We'll call it blushing.
7. but go ahead.
Anyway, it's been an incredible opportunity to work with you guys, and Taryn's over here telling me not to bang on the table because I'm just get so hyped up on this stuff.
You do.
So audience, if you can hear me banging on the table, I do apologize. I'm an Italian and I talk with my hands.
No, I love the talking with the hands. Anytime that somebody is very passionate about a subject, it really warms my heart.
And fantastic job. We have some big stuff in store for you, which you know about, which the world will know about soon. And thank you for joining us, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you guys for having me.
Honestly, I love talking to Emily about this stuff. I just think Emily is so passionate. Emily competed in our New York Law School soccer competition. She goes to me beforehand. She goes, Dan, I'm going to win this thing. I'm going to take it down. I'm going to do Conduct Detrimental proud. Emily didn't win, but it's not for lack of effort. We have different, I've worked with a lot of different associates and I've trained junior associates, but it's always good to see someone with this like can-do attitude with Emily. So I love that Emily's decided to join us on this lovely adventure of Conduct Detrimental. Tarun, what do you think of Emily's comments on the settlement and Hope Solo, all the fun stuff?
Yeah, I thought she was great. And typically they say when you don't have the facts, you bang the table, but she had the facts and she banged the table.
She's like Brandon Marshall, except Brandon Marshall doesn't have the facts. You're like one of only a handful of people that knows that reference. Okay. As we put this episode in the books, we wanted to cover this episode as kind of like a potpourri episode. We don't want this podcast to just be the NFL sports law podcast. There are sports law issues in any and all walks of life. Okay. So Tarun, I'm going to let you kick us off. What to watch for? What do you got?
So MLB says February 28th is kind of like the witching hour. If we don't have an agreement between the union and the league by that point, then we're not going to have a full slate of baseball, and they're not going to pay out the full rate of salary. So yeah, that's very worrisome to me. We're already into the time when pitchers and catchers would have reported, and we just haven't really made much progress. There's still huge gaps in terms of what the minimum salary is going to be. And then Jeff Passan brought up a great point today on Twitter. I highly urge everyone to read his thread about the competitive balance tax, the luxury tax. You should really understand that that's going to be a key sticking point. And we haven't even really gotten to that yet. So I'm not sure what's going to happen, Dan. And I'm worried because, we both love baseball. We love baseball and we might not have it. And the great thing about baseball is that it's there every day. And even if it lets you down one day, it can pick you back up the next day. So I would be really, really sad if we didn't have the season.
It's not looking good. I'm going to give you a quick shout, which we did not talk about on the podcast. And I think you half know the story. Tarun, I was in the middle of an all-day deposition on Zoom, and one of my friends goes, who is Tarun Sharma, and why does he think that spring training is going to be pushed? I'm like, what did Tarun do? It was a good friend of mine. And I see Tarun, breaking, spring training, pushed back, whatever it was, March 5th. And I go, Tarun, what, do you have a source? No one else is reporting this. And you're like, I used to work in baseball. I might have a source or two up my sleeve. You're looking at me like I'm going to reveal your source. I am not. Tarun beat Jeff Passan, friend of the show, and Bob Nightingale, friend of the show. Beat all of our friends, Tarun. Sometimes the little guy gets scooped. So I got to give you, you want to plug yourself, right? You're doing the strength emoji. There you go. My what to watch for story coming out of basketball. Kyrie Irving is one step closer to being a full-time player. New York City Mayor Eric Adams says that he cannot wait to roll back the current COVID-19 vaccine mandate for indoor spaces. And no, we're not really going to get into a lot of COVID stuff and back stuff. But as of right now, it's an interesting law that basically says that Kyrie Irving can play road games, but he can't play home games. And if Kyrie Irving can play home games, all of a sudden that makes the Brooklyn Nets a much more of a force in the Eastern Conference. So my what to watch for is the Nets coming back at full strength. Ben Simmons is going to come back at some point, and Kyrie Irving going to be the team of misfit toys. And you guys know I like the betting odds a little bit. I don't mind parlaying these futures. Let's say Danny Medvedev to win Wimbledon and the Nets to win the Eastern Conference. How about that, Tarun? How about that?
I like it. I wouldn't mind seeing either of those things.
Those are two sports ones. That is, those are my Novak props. I got a lot of parlays that have to do with Novak, and sports betting is legal in New York, so I'm allowed to talk about it.
I saw that Kyle Korver was teaching Ben Simmons how to shoot today, so maybe that's also a positive for the Nets.
Plenty of positives for the Nets, but we shall see. Okay, that'll put this episode in the books. I am at Sports Law Lust. Wallach is at Wallach Legal. Tarun is at TK Sharma Law. Mike, who did a great job on the front office sports panel today, is at Mike_son_of_law. For everyone, Conduct Detrimental, Brendan, Emily, and anybody else that wants to join the gang, we will see you next time on another episode of Conduct Detrimental.